EarthUp, our sponsor for the month of September. EarthUp enables employers to crowdsource corporate emissions reductions from their employees. This bottom-up approach reduces costs for sustainability teams while de-risking a company's emissions reduction strategy.
Hi everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. This is Amanda and Hsieh, and today I have Jayce Hafner with me from FarmRaise. I'm really excited to talk to her about what she's doing to help promote more sustainable and regenerative agriculture. Jayce is the CEO and founder of FarmRaise. So Jayce, hi, how are you?
Hi Amanda, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for making time for this. It's so interesting what you're doing with the FarmRaise platform. So I want to make sure our listeners understand what's happening in agriculture. And I was thinking, I looked it up actually between our intro call and today. I was like, I wonder how big is agriculture a contributor to greenhouse gas and kind of overall climate change. And it was interesting because energy, of course, is the biggest chunk, let's say. But the second biggest one is actually, it's kind of combined, but agriculture, forestry, and land use all together makes up the second biggest slice of the pie when we look at which sectors are our biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, I think agriculture is also a huge opportunity in helping us address climate change and helping to draw down carbon dioxide and carbon emissions and stored in carbon, as well as, address and help to address issues around water quality and quantity, as some of our folks, I think, in the Midwest and maybe more the West are feeling. But anyways, let's start at the beginning. Tell us about FarmRaise.
Yeah, absolutely. And, bringing in this climate angle here, I think is really smart. And it's what inspires us at FarmRaise. And it's part of our mission to build resilience in farming communities. And there's a massive opportunity here. I mean, agriculture specifically is around 11% of all, greenhouse gas emissions that we're working to mitigate. And when you see the challenge that this, massive $1 trillion sector is facing in mitigating those emissions, but also the opportunity that this sector has to sequester carbon, to rebuild soil health, to invest in clean water. I mean, there's just this greenfield opportunity ahead of us. And it all comes down to enabling farmers to adopt better business practices. And these regenerative or sustainable ag practices are great for the business, and they're also great for the environment. They're really a win-win. But the main blocker we've seen to having farmers actually adopt those practices is access to capital to de-risk these new business practices. And that piece is something that I've personally experienced growing up on an Angus beef cattle farm in Virginia as a kid and helping my dad out on the farm. One of the things we struggled with the most was the business side of the business, organizing all of our finances and applying for grants that could help us invest in the sustainability of our farm. When I was a teenager, we actually finally got one of those grants, and it was amazing for our landscape and for our farm business, because what it funded was new electric fencing and water systems that enabled us to then graze our cattle in a more holistic pattern that actually cycles soil carbon, invests in the organic matter of the soil and the water retention so that we actually can produce higher yields of grass. And as a result, graze our cattle outside longer throughout the year without having to buy hay. And that saved us a lot of money. And it also was great for the land and great for the cattle. And win-wins like that, I think, are what really inspire me. Growing up in this context, I was fascinated by, how can we invest in the landscape to bring resilience and opportunity for all creatures inhabiting that landscape. And so FarmRaise itself is a tool that enables farmers to have more efficient access to capital and better tools to manage their business, so that they can then be more profitable, more environmentally resilient, and ideally, operating with a level of social equity as well in terms of their ability to access the resources they need to thrive. So I gave you some context on, what informs me in the business. What else would you like to know?
Tell me more about, you mentioned as your personal experience with applying for and receiving one of these grants, but that I understand is one of the potential sources of capital for farmers, but it's not always easy to tap into. But tell me, I think you mentioned they're called conservation grants. So will you tell our listeners who are not familiar with it, what are conservation grants? What do they help conserve?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So just to kind of put the landscape together, there are hundreds of billions of dollars available or out on the market in terms of private debt, government grants, private grants, cost share programs from the state and local government, all basically funding opportunities that farmers can access and then put to use on their land. The challenge is a lot of these programs have a great number of very bureaucratic forms and confusing jargon embedded in the application process. And applying for these programs can take a really long time and be a huge stressor and a point of confusion and a headache for the farmer. But they also are really important to the farm because they are incentives that help the farmer actually invest in that sustainability piece. And that conservation funding program that you're asking about, I think is a critical one. It's about every year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture offers a few $billion in conservation funding support directly to farmers to invest in soil health practices like the ones we did on my operation. These are practices that can include cover cropping, planting a crop on a field during an off-season period when the field would otherwise be exposed and fallow, planting a crop so that you can actually reinvest in the organic matter of the soil. During that time, it can include sustainable grazing. It can include precision agriculture and better nutrient management and application to improve energy efficiency. It can also include things like no-till, low-till, or transitions to organic. So this program is actually administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is the conservation wing of the USDA. It's a fantastic program. It's heavily oversubscribed every year, but farmers really, really struggle to, especially small farmers or new farmers, struggle with the paperwork and really struggle with being competitive in this grant program. It just received a new infusion of capital. Actually, there was an announcement with the Inflation Reduction Act that program is going to get another $8 billion in funding, which is awesome. So that should, make it a little less competitive, but the paperwork and the uncertainty remain.
So you mentioned in the past, at least, it was oversubscribed, meaning that there are more farmers who wanted access to those funds than funds are available. So again, hopefully it eases it up with the new money that's been allocated there. But I guess one question I want to understand is, you mentioned there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of paperwork and just paperwork to get through. Is it also something that's what kind of lead times are we talking about? Like, I think about my perspective is, I'm going to borrow money. I'm going to get a mortgage, and I know I'm familiar with that process. Is it something like that, or is it a much longer process?
Yeah, depending on what funding program you're applying for, it can be as fast as, a few weeks or as long as 12 to 18 months. And when we're talking about conservation funding from the USDA, these program timelines lean more toward the latter. These long wait times. And this is a challenge for farmers because, like any small business operator, they're applying for this capital to de-risk innovation in their business. They have a project in mind, and they know that in order to make sure that project is carried out in the least risky way, they need an injection of cash to help fund those upfront costs. And the challenge with these massive conservation funding programs is that there's so much uncertainty when the farmer applies. They don't know exactly when the program will be approved, and it may take months before they get to a yes or a no, which makes it really hard to plan ahead. There are definitely opportunities in the private sector to mitigate that. Once you have a better sense of what farmers are the most competitive, there are private lending options that you could offer to mitigate that risk as the farmer waits. But the current, the status quo right now is really hard for farmers who are trying to plan ahead and de-risk these sustainable transitions on their farms.
Something else that I wonder is that, are there established best practices? As you mentioned, there's a variety of things that a farmer could do. Are there guidelines out there of, kind of this is the best practice depending on what type of animals you're raising or what types of crops you're planting, or how does that work?
That is, this is a thing about this field that has become absolutely fascinating to me as I've just gone in deeper and deeper. And what I've learned over the past few years helping farmers apply for these programs is there actually is an established list of best practices and what the government calls resource priority concerns. And that is a fancy name for the types of sustainable practices that the government elevates as especially important when a farmer is applying for this funding. And if the farmer indicates that they want to do one of those practices on their applications, can make them extra competitive. The challenge is these resource priority concerns differ across states and localities. So what a concern is in the Central Valley of California is going to be very different than a farmer operating on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert. There's just, they're completely different, resource constraints in that area. And so some counties prioritize water, others prioritize wildlife. And you really have to read into the legalese as a farmer in order to know which types of practices are going to make you the most competitive to get that funding, and hope that they line up with your vision for your farm business too.
Wow. I think that's interesting because I should know, first of all, there are best practice, these guidelines available, but it is very much a very regional, which makes sense if you think about how big the U.S. is and how different our geographies are across the big country. And something I want to revisit that you mentioned, you talked about also improving social equity. Yes. Will you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So what's really fascinating in agriculture right now is there is a generational shift that's happening. And when you hear about it on the news, what we often see is, oh my gosh, there's like this headline about farmers aging out, the baby boomer farmers are aging out, and who's going to take over those farms? Oh my gosh, there's a lot of anxiety around that in the media. What I don't see as much of, but I would love to see covered, because this is a data point that wowed me in the last agricultural census, is that almost 1 million of the 3.4 million farmers who are operating today are either young or beginning farmers. This is a new wave of farmers coming in. Almost a third of all farmers out there fit this category. And they are young, they are more diverse, and they are incredibly innovative in the way they run their businesses, which means they are probably digitally native, and they also want to experiment with some of these innovative regenerative agriculture practices. In many ways, I think this is a very hopeful time in farming, as you're seeing so many new farmers looking to get into the space. And with COVID and the addition of remote work, I think you're going to see more and more farm operators popping up all over the US as folks transition into doing part-time, maybe then full-time farming as they make that move. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And as we look at this new crop of farmers who are more diverse, who are younger, we also see this particular segment facing barriers in accessing capital from the USDA. One, because they're startup farmers. They don't yet have a farm number registered with the USDA. They have to go through that process. They may not have an existing, most of them who are just beginning actually don't have an existing relationship with the USDA. And we found that farmers who know someone at their local office who is looking out for them and give them an alert when a new funding pool opens, those farmers are especially competitive to get to funding because they're in the know. But these new and beginning farmers are not as plugged in yet, and they don't necessarily know the ropes. And so at FarmRaise, our goal is actually to specifically go after that segment of farmers who are currently underrepresented, who are young, beginning, farmers of color, women farmers who may have been, I don't think left behind is the right word, but overlooked in past decades, and now bring them into a place where it's easier for them to just plug and play with these funding programs and to apply with confidence, to know how the system works, and to really work the system to grow their farm businesses and to be competitive. That gets me really excited, this element of social equity. Our mission at FarmRaise is restoring vitality in farming communities, and it's really a 3-pillar thing, and the social equity piece is huge, and then environmental resilience and profitability being those two other stool legs.
Would you say with the users of the FarmRaise platform, do you see that same representation of like that same percentage or of diverse minority, of whether they're female or minority farmers?
We do. In the last analysis I did, we were looking at 4x the number of farmers of color on our platform versus what we saw reflected in participation rates in USDA programs. And then we also see an amazing representation of women farmers. Depending on the month, we fluctuate around 49 to 52% of our users are female farmers. So there's a great number of women on there as well.
And then when you say a new farmer, maybe a part-time farmer, Can you describe it a little bit more just so I have kind of something more tangible, more visual? Like, what does that mean? Does it mean you just have a couple of acres that you're just starting off as a hobby, as for your weekend?
Yeah. So for us, we think about farmers in a few different categories. We almost think of them as composite, like customer segments, if you will. So the first segment that we see coming to FarmRaise a lot, but we actually can't serve right now, is aspiring farmers, like someone who's decided they want to be a farmer, they want to learn more, they want to buy a farm and get started. This is a tough segment for us to work with right now because it's really risky and there's not a lot of capital out there for that type of farmer. You want to ideally lend to or give a grant to someone who has more of a track record. So that's one segment. And then there's another segment, which is the beginning farmer segment. And these are farmers with between 1 to 10 years of farming experience. Most of them have at this point acquired land, they have some sales as well, and showing that they have some, markers of a healthy business. The full-time part-time thing is tough because a ton of farmers have side hustles or other jobs they work, like construction, or they do custom work. And so I think, when you look at the ag census, a number of those farmers will be working side hustles. And so that's less important to us than do they depend on the farm as a meaningful source of income? And are they bringing in sales that help to support, them as individuals or their family?
And then what percentage would you say of FarmRaise subscribers is more of the start or the beginning farmer, more than the kind that I'm thinking of? What I typically think of is, really established family farms, huge amount of acreage where you're just driving and the fields go on and on.
Yeah. So our typical user does have a few hundred acres, but they are really diversified in their approach. And I think this plugs back into the concept of being innovative as a farm operator, and that really being the target segment we're going after. So while they do have, small to mid-size operations, our most, common user, they are really, really innovative. And even if they're not beginners, we find that they have like a beginner's mindset in their approach to farming. They're curious, they're looking to learn more and more. We certainly have farmers that have smaller operations as well, and they can be maybe a microgreen or a vertical farmer in an urban area, or they can be, a small diversified veggie farm that has 10 acres and maybe some chickens. So, and then on the other side, we have customers who have thousands of acres and are operating those, nutrient, high density protein crops in the Midwest. So there's diversity, but I'd say that target that we have is around a few hundred acres and several years at least of experience.
I was having an interesting conversation with the director of a startup incubator, and I was asking her, what do we need more of to accelerate change? What is what's missing? And it was an interesting challenge where it's kind of chicken and the egg. Do you get the funding first, or do you have the project or the pilot first? And it's kind of, how do you get funding for the pilot? It's kind of this chicken or egg thing. But it sounds like with farming, you really need to have some type of established farm in order to get the funding, something started at least. Like you said, it's not so much for the aspiring, but it's really you have something and you really want to improve it and grow it.
Ideally, you have some sort of existing asset, whether it's land or equipment, or you've identified land that you can rent. Yeah. That said, there are programs from the USDA that are fantastic for farmers who don't yet have that land asset yet. One I would point to is the Farm Service Agency microloan program. These are really low interest loans that help beginning farmers acquire land just to get started. And what they need to show is that they have some experience working on a farm, but it's not necessarily their farm. So that is one program that we point a lot of users to, and we actually help a number of users apply for as well.
Another connection I was thinking about is, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of ESG linked loans or sustainability linked loans, but they're outcome based. So a company may borrow money and it's tied to, let's say, greenhouse gas reduction. And if they reduce it by X percentage, then they have this interest rate. If they have another percentage, maybe they have a better interest rate. If they don't meet their goals, they have a higher interest rate, whatever. But it's a little bit, it incentivizes that outcome. Are most of these programs based on kind of the outcome as well, like how much you're able to save or reduce, or is it more based on the implementation of a new activity or equipment or whatever it is? How does it typically work?
Currently for USDA programs, it's mostly practice-based. So you're getting paid to do a practice regardless of the outcome. There are folks on the inside who are looking at that closely and thinking through whether that's the right model moving forward. But currently it's more practice-based. But there are also private funds that are really innovative and doing super cool things, I think, to spur and incentivize soil health practices through the way they lend to farmers. One example of that is Replant Capital. Another example of that is Mad Agriculture's Perennial Fund and the whole Mad Ag paradigm. These are, funds that are lending to farmers to specifically implement soil health practices or to fund operations that are geared toward, organic or regenerative farming. And so we're really excited to link our farmer customers up with those innovative programs, especially in conjunction with some of the government programs, because what I've found is farmers like the practice-based incentive model as much as they appreciate, also having an outcomes-based tied to another program stacked on it, because farmers require some predictability. They like to have that predictability. If I change this business practice, I can count on this thing happening, or at least I can bet on it. Like any small business owner, they want to be as, risk averse as possible.
Absolutely. There's so many other variables that they need to deal with that,
Exactly.
more than, right. It's agriculture, it's ranching. There's so many other variables out of their control. I can see why they would want that one under well-defined.
They're dealing with the markets, they're dealing with weather, they're dealing with climate change. Like there's so much that really is out of their control. And farmers are great about taking on risk. I think they are really smart about it. They have their own predictive model depending on the business that helps them make decisions, but they are also, want to be as thoughtful about that as possible. So any way they can curb risk outside of, all the other risk buckets they're taking on, the more empowered they're going to be successful, and also to be less anxious. Farming is such a tough profession mentally too. And there's so much loneliness in the profession, and there's a lot of just uncertainty. They're really like the truest entrepreneurs in the sense that they're dealing with all sorts of unknowns and just like doing the best they can to navigate a situation that is unique to them, given where they are geographically and the natural resource assets they're working with. And so the more that we can work with farmers to help them de-risk their decisions, the more confidence they have, and I really believe the more successful their operation will be.
What do you think we need more of? It sounds like there's some cool innovation in the financing aspect happening, but is there enough funding from the start, or do we just need more of this kind of interesting financial innovation? Maybe it's all of the above.
We absolutely need more funding. The flagship conservation program is still oversubscribed, and we see that often large operations take a larger chunk of that funding than the small operations do proportionally. And that's really, really challenging when you look at that pie going toward these large successful operations, while these small and mid-sized, more fledgling operators that often do really invest in sustainability aren't getting that, that source of capital, which they so desperately need. And so that is one piece that I think could be tweaked, certainly, is more funding specifically targeted at small and mid-sized farmers. But there's also an opportunity to stack public and private capital more efficiently to achieve these outcomes. And that's something that I think we can lean into more as a country.
Jayce, if people want to learn more about FarmRaise, of course, they can go to the website. Are there any other resources that you would recommend our listeners visiting to learn more about either FarmRaise or agriculture in the United States in general?
Yeah, check out our blog on farmraise.com, because we've highlighted some of the major challenges farmers are facing right now and ways that they can hack those challenges. So we write articles from a farmer-centric perspective, so you can learn a ton about how farmers think about risk, how they're dealing with ways to up-level their business in a more regenerative and profitable way by tuning into that blog. We're also trying to highlight farmers that we're working with, so you can get more resources on there, as well as some of the capital partners that we love referring farmers to, and some of the really innovative stuff that they're doing. So I'd say check out the blog. We're trying to emulate, a very sort of farmer forward approach there, in terms of just giving farmers the most actionable and relevant knowledge that they need to be successful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being my guest today. This is fascinating. I think you might be one of our first or second guests talking about sustainable agriculture, but it's something that we don't get to explore often. So I really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Amanda. It's been wonderful to chat. And I love that you're bringing in this agricultural, lens to the ESG world, because it's such an important part of the, solving the greenhouse gas emission behemoth. And it's essential to, ensuring the safeguarding really the future of the world, making sure we can eat. So
we have enough food to eat. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks again to our sponsor, EarthUp, whose mission is to make sustainability a part of everyone's job so companies can meet their emissions goals. Visit them at earthup.eco.